Popular Conservatism UK. I think that's probably quite a good thing to be, Mark, because I think Neil O'Brien represents unpopular conservatism. He just stood there on College Green criticising Labour, and it sort of doesn't wash over anybody at all, because everyone goes, well, hang on a minute, you guys were in for 14 years, you sat in cabinet meetings, you didn't do anything.
Yeah, it's a fair criticism, Mike, and I think it goes to the enormous task that Kemi Badenoch's got, because she can say that the Conservative Party is under new management and new leadership, but has it changed its spots? What's the explanation for really such a disappointing outcome after 14 years of Conservative government? Taxes at their highest level since the Second World War, government spending out of control, regulation out of control. If you'd just taken a snapshot when the Conservatives got into office in 2010 and another snapshot when they left office in 2024, you might have assumed there was 14 years of socialist government. So the Conservative Party needs a rather better, bolder explanation for why things went so wrong. Well,
that's right, because in a way, if Keir Starmer does appear to be a more right-wing Prime Minister than Rishi Sunak was or than Boris Johnson was, in the end, he'll do well. He'll do better, because people will say, well, perhaps he isn't this mad lefty. And depending on what Reform do, and depending what happens to the Conservative Party, there seems, I was going to ask you about that as well, Labour, it could be the way for Labour to actually stay in power, to go more to the right.
Yeah, well, it will unsurprise you to know, Mike, that I basically think that the facts of life are conservative and reality is biting this government.
Yeah.
It turns out that you can't just spray around money left, right and centre, that you can't expect economic growth just by issuing press releases and statements saying that you're wishing for it.
Right.
If you're serious about turning the economy around, you've got to tackle an awful lot of wasteful spending. I mean, a whole series of jaw-dropping anecdotes that you've already read out on your show in just the last few minutes, Mike. You've got to get that under control.
Yeah.
And you've got to get tax and regulation down. Now, the Labour government are moving somewhat in that direction. I understand Rachel Reeves is now meeting regulators to sort of ask them what their plan is for growth. But the best way to get growth...
Yeah, but why is she asking them? They're the wrong...
these regulators.
But they're the wrong people to ask, aren't they?
That's exactly right. You want to ask the businesses what's standing in their way for growth. And that will almost certainly mean incinerating a good number of regulations and scrapping a good number of regulators. They've edged a little bit in this direction. I'm delighted that they've scrapped NHS England, for example,
yes,
the biggest quango and bureaucracy in the world. But the problem is our whole system is geared to creating bureaucracy faster than you can cut it back. So it's going to need a much bolder strike than to sit around talking to regulators about how they might tweak something here or...
Well, exactly. I mean, she's talking today, and I think there's an announcement coming later on about this, about cutting back red tape on business. Well, I'm sure most businesses would be quite happy with that, but they would rather they hadn't been given a great big national insurance hike to deal with as well, because I think they'd rather not have to pay more tax, rather than if the offer was, we'll take away red tape and you can pay more tax, or we'll leave the red tape where it is and you can pay less tax. I think I know what they'd all want.
Yeah, no, that's right, Mike. And I'm very fond of Ronnie Reagan's old quote when you're looking at economic problems, that there are no easy solutions, but there are simple solutions. And what he meant is often it's politically difficult, so it's not easy, but it's pretty straightforward what you need to do. You need to get the tax burden down. It is absolutely ludicrous. We're taxing basically the winners and the productive in society and giving more and more money to those who aren't winners. And are net beneficiaries. Now, if you keep transferring money from those who are working hard and innovating and producing businesses and giving it to those who aren't, guess what? Your economy remains on the floor with virtually zero economic growth, probably even going backwards. So somebody's got to have the guts to call this out, to say it. And we're going to need quite radical surgery, I think, not just a little bit of a trim here or a little bit of a haircut there, something rather more dramatic than that. And Neil O'Brien was saying that he suspects that the Labour government aren't really up to that task. I fear that's true. I mean, I'd like the Labour government to do well, even though I'm not a supporter of them, just for the sake of the country. But you're already seeing any mention of trying to get benefits under control. And there's a sort of huge rebellion from dozens of Labour MPs. So they're hemmed in by their own side often.
They are. And what do you make of some of the reports over the weekend that there's a sort of there's a coup afoot, if you like, within the Conservative movement, and certainly Conservative Party? A lot of people not thinking that Kemi Badenoch will last much beyond the May elections, the local elections that is, because they'll be so bad for the Tories, and it may well be that somebody else is already being lined up. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the Conservative Party's got almost addicted to regicide, Mike. I
Yeah.
was looking through some of the statistics. Since the Brexit referendum, the average Premier League football manager has lasted 750 days. The average Conservative Party leader has averaged only 680 days in office. The Conservative Party are even more trigger happy than football clubs in getting rid of the person at the top. So I think it'd be quite useful if the Tories turned their attention away from sort of what are Kemi's strengths and weaknesses and tried to work out what the underlying problems are. Because pretty much in politics, as in football, if you're changing your manager every 5 minutes, it's usually a sign that there's a more systemic problem than just the weaknesses of the manager. So they've got to get, I think, a better story about why the 14 years in office didn't turn out anything like it should have done. Worry a bit less about personalities, but be much bolder about what Britain needs to do. I think a problem with the way Kemi's approaching things at the moment is, well, we'll tell you what our policies are in 2 years' time.
Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, Reform is firing out policy positions left, right, and centre. So it's unsurprising that the Conservatives are struggling somewhat in the polls, and Reform, despite all its internal travails, seems to be holding up pretty well.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be bothering the polls whatsoever. I mean, somebody I was reading at the weekend, I can't remember who it was, who said that the Reform Party is a bit like the Rolling Stones. You know, when Brian Jones left, they just carried on. And maybe that's what happens now.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, the whole fallout with Rupert Lowe, I think, was a bit of an inside the Beltway story that, you know, people at home aren't really that interested in who's falling out with who at Westminster. They're more interested in what any given political party is going to do to tackle the tax burden, get the economy going, sort out immigration and the like. So these sort of inside Westminster stories of people falling out don't necessarily have traction. I think a little bit of a problem for Reform and Nigel Farage there is if it plays into a story that he finds it pretty difficult to work with people, especially high-profile people of talent, that might actually stem what otherwise could have been further defections from the Conservative Party to Reform. It might be that Tory MPs, any who are thinking that maybe they should jump in that direction, are scratching their head a bit more and saying, well, if he's likely to fall out with Rupert Lowe, then probably he'll fall out with me. So the actual long-term effect of it could be that it stems Reform's growth somewhat in terms of its parliamentary ranks if